Hello, I'm Li Hao. Today we're going to talk about Svelte options. So Svelte options is a special element in Svelte which allows you to customize compile options of your Svelte component. Customize compile options for a Svelte component. What is that? Well, if we're not sure about compile options of Svelte components, basically Svelte options is it's beyond us, right? So let's first take a look at what are they. So over here, when I'm looking at API docs, which shows, which if you go to the Svelte compile section, it says that you can use this Svelte.compile method function to compile your Svelte source code. So usually you don't do this yourself. You use some plugins or loaders based on your build tools. So for example, if you are using Rollup, you're using Rollup plugin Svelte. If you're using Webpack, you're using Svelte loader. Using something else, it's something plugin Svelte something, right? So under the hood, they are calling Svelte compiler, which is a method called Svelte.compile to compile your code into JavaScript, right? It takes in the Svelte source code that you write and it spits out JavaScript code. And this method itself, the first argument is the source code you write. The second argument is the options. It's actually the compile options for your Svelte component. So over here, there's a lot of things. For example, the file name. So this is useful for debugging. There's like name, there's format, there's generate, there's def, whether it's development mode or production mode, so that whether you insert more runtime checks or insert more debugging methods or functions inside, right? Then you have immutable, hydratable, legacy, accessors, custom elements. So there's a lot of things over here, which I'm not going to go through each of everyone, especially those that are related to custom elements. We're going to talk about them more extensively when we talk about custom elements. Okay? So stay tuned. If you want to watch about that, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when that's it out. So here, if you scroll through, you probably see that some of the things sounds familiar if you read the docs or tutorials for Svelte options. Okay, if you haven't, so here I'm gonna jump over to take a look. Right, here I'm at the Svelte tutorial. It says that you can have Svelte options to make some changes, right? So here are the options that you can set: immutable, accessors, namespace, and tags. So these are here, right? So you have tag, you have accessors, and you have immutable. So here, if I read it out, it says that blah 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 blah, right? So instead of reading them out, we're gonna try one by one and see what that affects the source code that Svelte is generating for us. Right? So we are gonna focus on these three. Rather, we're gonna focus on two, which is immutable and accessors and namespace. So three. So for tag, which is related to custom elements, again I've said we're gonna talk about that extensively when we're gonna talk about custom elements. Subscribe to my channel again, okay, if you want to get notified for that. So here, let's take a look at the first one, which is a more simpler one, right? We start from simpler and move our way up to something more complex. So we're gonna start with namespace. So here we are back at our REPL. Over here, this is our code. And over here on the right is the output. So if you take a look when you write div, and if we write some SVG elements, for example, a group element, if you go over here and look at the JS outputs, you'll realize that they end up a different code, which is one is created using a function called element, and the other is using a function called SVG element. Why are they different? That's because the underlying API is different. One is created using document.create element, and another would be document create element namespace, right? If I'm not wrong. So why is this difference? Well, because Svelte has how does Svelte knows that this G element is supposed to be SVG? Well, Svelte maintains a list of all the elements over here. So here I'm at the source code at compiler, where it sees that over here SVG elements are all this, right? Alt glyph, depths, animate motion, circle, color, depths, and everything that you see over here. So they are created using a different API from the DOM. That's why you need to differentiate them. But however, if for some reasons when you are creating an element and this element is not in this list, in this SVG list, and Svelte has no idea that this is actually an SVG element, then there's one way that you can tell Svelte that, okay, hey, how about this? All these elements that is written in this component should be considered as an SVG element. And how you do that is you're going to use a namespace option over here. So you could either pass it to I'm not sure you have this namespace over here. Yeah, you could either pass it as namespace over here in the compile options, which you can have HTML, mathml, SVG, foreign, and foreign. Over here, what we want is SVG, right? So you can tell that, okay, hey, you create this element using SVG element. So you come over here and write Svelte options namespace equals to SVG. You can close it immediately. You can close it later on. It's okay. But here you see namespace is SVG, and you take a look at the code. Now we're creating elements. We even treat divs as SVG. Right? So if you're using other things like say Svelte natives or other elements that seems like a normal DOM elements but it's not, then you can actually pass different namespace. For example, how about instead of using document elements, maybe you create a new namespace called foreign and you use that to create an element, right? Custom namespace. So this is the namespace option. Fair enough, right? Just treat all these elements whether they are using a normal element document create elements API, because that's only for HTML. If it's SVG or it's other things, math, HTML, and other stuff, you use a different. You just tell Svelte that, okay, use a different namespace. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, which is accessors, true or false, right? Adding getters and setters. What does that mean? Okay, so here if you have props, for example, here I have named props, I can add accessors, which is like getters for this, getters and setters for my props. So let's take a look at what does that mean. So over here, I'm going to copy all this code and come over here and say component. Paste this in. Remove this. Okay, so here I have my components, and if I import this component, imports component, and add this in over here. I can bind the instance of this component to a variable. So I'm going to bind this to component. Here, I'm going to add on mount so that I know for sure this component instance is available. And on mount, I'm going to come over here and say component. I'm going to console log this component. So this should give us the instance of this component. So of course I need to declare this variable. So here, probably you can't see anything, but if you you open the console, you should see that. Okay, let me clear this and run this again. You should see that this component have some methods to it. Most of them are private. The only thing that you kind of able to use is if you come over here to look at component API, which is this. These are the so-called slightly public methods. For example, set on for events and destroy to remove your components. Right? So if you come over here and use set, you can set the props. Right? So here I'm gonna say component dot set. I'm gonna pass in a object, and here I have name, right? So I'm gonna pass name to something else. Name to by. So here, if I take a look, this name, this variable, this props, as the value, we update the value of the props using the sets $sets method to update the by, a name to by, and you see this value has changed. Of course, this you can use this, but sometimes you want a slightly easier way of getting the props or changing the props. Over here, there's no way that for you to basically read out the value of the props, right? So what we need is so-called accessors. So we're gonna add the Svelte options to the components that we want to have accessors, which is this component. Come over here and say Svelte options accessors equals to true. So false is the default. If you take a look here, it says false is the default. If we want the getter and setters, we need to pass it as true. So here we have accessors as true. Now what we can do is we can come over here and say component dot by name equals to by. At the same time, if you take a look at one of the components that's log out, you can see properties over here right now. Previously there's no such thing, and now you have new property, and we can now read the value out and update value directly over here using accessors. So now if I close the console and take a look at the output, let's see what's the difference. Right? So we're focused on the components and see over code over here. So it generates a class for your component, and it adds this to the name, the getter for the name and the setter for updating the name. Right? Under the hood is still using the .set method, except that it's much easier for you to just call component.set name equals something, right? So that you can set it. If you remove this line or just change this to false, then this to getter and setter is not generated. So by default, this is false. For some reason, if you want this, you can turn it to true. Right? This is usually I'm not sure what is being used in real life, but one very nice cases that been using is in the test cases for Svelte source code. You will see that this is turned on so that we can just read out the props value so that we can verify and we can check in our test cases, assert whether the props is right now the value that we are expecting. So this is accessors. So if you have multiple options that you want to change, for example, just now we were saying like a namespace and now it's accessors, then you use the same Svelte option element and add more stuff over here, right? If you try to create another Svelte options elements, you probably see that it will say that one component can only have one Svelte options tag. So you can only have one. So if you want to have configure multiple of them, just create multiple attributes, right? Here, now we are fully that's okay for accessors. So we're going to move on to the last one, which is immutable. So if you watch my previous videos on Svelte Store, you probably noticed that in the immutable store, we talk about how we use this when we are saying that we want to have immutable data. So what is this immutable options? Okay, so here is explanation from my a slightly easier explanation on this option itself. So by default, if you come over here, let's continue using this component. Let me set it up first. Say for example, I have another state object called object. Okay, this is an object and has a few properties. Say maybe name equals to my name, and maybe age. No, age is a secret. Okay, secret. So here I have an object, and I can show the value of this state. So I'm coming over here and object dot okay, let me, okay, this is not, let's just comment this out, right? Okay, what's wrong with, okay, now we have object dot name and is object dot age. Okay, so I'm gonna read this name and object name and object age, and you can see this display on the screen. Okay, that shouldn't be a problem. So now we have a buttons that we want to updates the object, right? So when I have this button, when I click this button, what happens is that I will set maybe object.name equals to Svelte. So when I click this button, let's see, let's have this button. Hey, where does my button go? Oh, okay. Namespace is SVG, so it's creating an SVG element. And creating elements in an SVG namespace. That's why you don't see the button over here. Let's remove this. I'll change it to HTML to tell you that this is the default. See the button over here. So here, if I click on the button, it mutates the object by setting the name equals to Svelte. And now you can see this is updated on the screen, right? I think we've been used to do this and this is the default behavior of Svelte, right? So what happens is that actually what Svelte cares is down to the bottom of this is it only cares about the state variable, right? So name is not really a state variable. It's the object itself is a variable that is a state. So any top level variables over here that can be changed and is being used in a template is considered as states variable. So like name and object over here, not this object name or object.age, right? So every time when you change something, when you change this object, it will go to Svelte and say, okay, this is changed. But before that, we also need to verify whether is it actually changed. So for example, if you come over here and do something like name equals to world, since it's already world and you try to click, and so if you do this, you're changing name to back to the same value, nothing will happen. When I say nothing will happen, it's not like you click and you see nothing has happened, right? Of course, it's gonna, even if something has happened, it's updating the variable world, the name to the value world, and you don't see it happen. But when I say nothing has happened, is that it's actually nothing has happened. So if you import, say before update, so technically this function should call when there's an update and right before something has updated, right? So if you come over here and register a before update, and let's just add maybe like a console log to let us know whether something is happening, like something is updating, you realize that, okay, when I click this button, nothing has happened. You don't see a before update. It's being logged out. If you change this to world 2, when you click, you see that before update is being called, right? 2 times, right? The first time is when we mount this component. Second time is when you click on the button. But you're changing back to the same value. Nothing has happened. Why? Because right before when you assign, or right after you do an assign, and before Svelte say, hey, this variable has changed, actually Svelte does one check. It checks whether the value is the same as what is being assigned to. So if the value is exactly the same, then we can just even skip this update cycle. Don't run like before updates and go and check like updates the elements and then call like after update and all those stuff. Don't do anything because nothing is gonna change. But how about object? If you do this, if you come over here and do this to object, what are you going to compare with? If you're going to compare by the object reference, nothing has changed, right? You are mutating the object reference is still the same, then technically nothing should happen. But because we've been kind of promoting mutating this object in a sense where we're saying like you can just change this object directly and it should trigger a a change, an update. So this comparison, this compare method of comparing whether something has changed or not is not your typical triple equal. It's not your typical referential equal that compares and see whether something has changed. It actually has an special case for objects and function. It treats all objects or function as it's always changing, right? As long as you do this and say, oh, I guess object is changing, and you call this function to check, it will always say that, okay, if it's on the object, it should be changing, right? I don't check the value at all. And if you take a look at this generated code over here, what this function that I just described is called save not equal over here. And you can read this source of save not equal over here. Let me find it for you. It's called runtime internal util. It's called save not equal. Let me zoom it up if it's not clear enough. It says that compare this object, right? If something has changed, or as long as the object is object or function, it should be changing. Just treat it as it will change. If you assign to something else, although you're assigning it to the same object reference, as long as you are assigning to an object, it should you just treat it as it has changed, right? So this is how it is, and you can actually change this behavior, right? If you all the assignments that you're doing, even to objects, are not mutable, meaning you're not mutating this object, then you can have this flag turned on, which is called immutable. Immutable, we set it to true. Then now Svelte trusts you that you say that everything when you want to change, it's going to be an immutable change, meaning it believes you say that this is not going to happen. So whenever you try to access to something like this, you will just check the object reference. You will check your object versus the reference of the object that was currently. And if you try to click this button now, you see that nothing has happened. Before update, it's not being called. But don't forget, you are still mutating the object. Meaning, if you come over here and say, maybe we add some timeout, some interval to log out the value of the object, say here on mounts, and we're gonna add this when on mounts. Let me type let's interval id equals to set interval every maybe 1 second. I'll say console log object and return clear interval id. Okay, so now every second we are consoling out the object, and when you click yes, nothing has changed, but do you realize that this object name has changed to Svelte? Okay, there I believe we have been running this. There's a lot of things being running because we refresh. So let me just refresh, and only it hot reloads every time when I type. That's why maybe there's a lot of things printed out at the same time, right? So now we only have one object printed once a second. So here again, when we click the button, nothing has changed, but you mutate the object, and now you see that the object name is Svelte. You mutate the object, right? But then because Svelte trusts you that when you won't do mutation, right? Meaning when you do this, it will still say, okay, I want to, something has changed, object has changed here. Okay, go and check. But now you're not used this, what's that called again? You're not calling save not equal. You're not using save not equal. You're using not equal over here. You're using not equal, which is comparing, is a triple equal comparison to your, to the object. Right, so if you take a look at the source code now, scroll all the way down, it's called not equal. Right, this is a triple equal, meaning if your object reference is still the same, we are not considered it as a change, right? There's no special case for object over here. So if you do this, then yeah, you're not gonna see any changes happening on the screen. So the way to now is to do this, right? Object equals to, and then you do a you're not mutating object, rather you try to maybe update the object over here manually. So age equals to object.age, right? You create, rather update, sorry, I shouldn't say updates, but rather you create a new object every time you want to mutate. So here you call name, spelled, and age equals to the original age. Or usually what people likes to do is to just spread this object, and because there's a lot of properties that could be changing, so you do a spreading. Let me. Oh, no wonder it's not working. It should be clear interval. No wonder it's not cleaning up for me. Okay, let me refresh again. Right, so here you do this, and now you look at the object. When I click, it changed to Svelte. Right now you say I'm not gonna mutate, I'm gonna create a new object for you. Right, so when is this useful? This is useful when you are using, when you update object every time immutably, right? Meaning every time when you want to update something, you create a new object. Or maybe when you're using some sort of library that promises your data, that makes your data to be immutable, right? And you can turn on this immutable flag only on that component when you're using those kind of data. You don't have to apply to all the components, right? Usually when you come over here to your compile options that we've seen so far, usually you specify this in your build tool to your plugins, right? Your Svelte loaders or rollup plugin Svelte. So that will apply to all the components. But here you are only turning it on for this particular component. If your other component is changing object mutably, it's still okay. It is still okay. So right now, if I look at JS output, this is still safe not equal. But for component Svelte, if you scroll down, it says it's not equal, right? So this will only apply to one component only. So so the inverse of it is you're gonna say immutable to be false, but that we know is the default behavior, right? It says this is the default behavior. So there you go. We've talked about immutable options, namespace options, and accessors options. So options are like compiler options that determines what is your output, your generated code will look like, whether to add extra code or change some of the output of your generated JavaScript code from a Svelte source code, right? Usually you provide this to your plugin for your build system, but if you want to apply this only for one component only, then you can use this Svelte options element, which allows you to change only this component. So there you go, Svelte options. If you have any questions, comments down below, because I believe all these are very different from what we have used to be doing, because this is more of a meta level. You try to change the output code and tweak a bit on the behavior, which we don't usually interact every time when we're using Svelte, but it is there. So if you have any questions, comments down below. I'll try my best to answer all of them. And as always, you find this useful, helpful, click like and share it to the world. Share this wonderful video that you learn if you learn something and you want your friends and your colleagues to know about it. And as always, subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when the next one is out. Especially custom elements is coming soon. So see ya. Bye bye.